I have buried a wife, a brother, and just about every soft thing I ever let myself want. By the time I was 50, I figured grief, and I had said everything we had to say to each other. Then two Apache children looked up at me from the bottom of a dry wash, dust in their hair, their mother gone cold beside them, and the smaller one asked me a question so plain that any sensible man would have shrugged it off and ridden on. I did not ride on, and a week later, in a country that was hanging men for less than what I'd done, one of those children asked me a second question. 5 words, that's all it was. 5 words, and the whole shape of my life came apart in my hands like wet rope. If you've ever wondered whether one small voice can turn a hard man inside out, stay with me. This is the story I never told anybody. I'm telling it now because there's nobody left it can hurt. The first thing I noticed was the flies. Not the children, the flies. A low, patient hum coming up out of the wash where no sound had any business being, in the middle of a country so dry the lizards had gone quiet. I reined up Deuce, that's my mule, old as sin and twice as stubborn, and I sat there in the saddle listening, because in that year in that territory, a sound you couldn't explain was a sound that could get you killed. It was August of '86. The whole of Arizona was holding its breath. The army had Geronimo's people on the run in the Sierra Madre, and every ranch and railhead between Tucson and the border was thick with soldiers and bounty and rumor. Folks were nervous the way a herd gets nervous before lightning, all of them looking the same direction, ready to bolt at nothing. I kept to myself and my failing patch of grays up above Lodestone Creek, and I minded the flies. I got down off Deuce. I remember I was braiding. I've got this habit, a bad one, of carrying a strip of rawhide in my coat and braiding, and unbraiding it with my fingers when my mind won't sit still. Marta used to say I'd braid at my own funeral. I had it going that morning, 3 strands over and under, and I only noticed I was doing it when I stopped. Because there was a woman at the bottom of that wash, and she was dead. She'd been dead a day, maybe 2. She was Apache. I knew that much from her dress and her hair and the little coil of soft leather at her wrist, and she had died the way people were dying all across that country that summer, from too much sun and too little water and running too far from men on horses. She had crawled up under the cutbank into what shade there was. She had made it that far. There is a particular kind of tired that a body carries even after the breath is gone, and she had it. And in the crook of her arm and pressed up under her were 2 children. I want to tell you I moved right away. I didn't. I stood at the lip of that wash for what felt like a long time and was probably 10 seconds, and every cowardly, sensible thought I owned went through my head at once. Ride on. It's not your trouble. There's soldiers 3 miles off who'd take them. There's a bounty on grown bucks and no bounty at all on this, so leave it, leave it. This is nothing you want any part of. In 1886, a white man found with Apache children was a man with some hard explaining to do, and the territory was not in a listening mood. Then the smaller of the 2 lifted its head and looked at me. A girl, 6 years old, maybe 7, I was never any good at telling. She had her mother's face already, that grave, wide-set steadiness, and she looked up at me out of the dust with no fear in her at all, which unsettled me more than screaming would have. Screaming I'd have understood. This was something else. She looked at me the way you look at weather. Something that had come and would do whatever it was going to do, and there was no point being afraid of it. The boy did not look up. He had his back to me and his body curved around the girl, and I understood without being told that he was the older one by minutes or by months, and that whatever protecting was getting done, he was the one doing it. He had a hand fisted in the back of his sister's dress. Even asleep, if he was asleep, he wouldn't let go. I climbed down into the wash. My knees told me all about it, and I crouched there in front of these 2 children beside their dead mother, and I did not have the first idea in the world what to do, so I did the thing I always do, which is talk. Well, I said, this is a fix. The girl watched my mouth. You understand me any? I asked. English, Espanol. Nothing, but she watched, and the watching was a kind of answer. I had a canteen. That was the thing that broke it in the end, not any noble feeling, just the canteen on my hip and the crack in that child's lips. I uncapped it and held it out, and the boy came awake and around so fast I near fell backward, and there was a knife in his hand, a little worn skinning knife, and he had it up between me and his sister before I'd so much as breathed. He couldn't have been 8 years old. And he held that knife like he'd already decided he was going to die and had only to settle the price. I have thought about that boy's face for 40 years. I have never once been able to describe it to my own satisfaction. There was a man's whole judgment in it. He looked at the canteen. He looked at me. He was doing arithmetic no child should have to do. Is the water worth the risk? Is this one lying? What happens to her if I'm wrong? And I sat very still and let him do it. And I set the canteen down in the dirt between us and took my hand away. There, I said, it's yours, I'm not reaching for it. He didn't understand the words. He understood the hand coming back. He waited a good long while, and then he took the canteen with his left, the knife still up in his right, and he did not drink. He gave it to his sister first, made her drink first, watching me the whole time. Only when she'd had her fill did he tip it back himself, and even then he stopped short, the way a person stops who has learned that water runs out. I have known grown men, churchmen, who could not have done that. Given the water away first, with a knife in their hand and their own throat on fire. I sat in that wash and watched an 8-year-old do it without thinking, and something in me that I'd walled up good and thick after Marta died put its hand against the wall. We buried the mother. That is to say, I dug and the children watched, and when I laid her in and started to fill it, the girl came and knelt at the edge and put something down in the grave with her, a little cloth doll, corn husk and thread. And the boy said something low in a language I'd never heard spoken so close, and the girl repeated it, and I stood there with my hat in my hands, feeling like the intruder I was. I don't hold with much. But I'll tell you that I have stood in white churches and felt less than I felt at the edge of that hole in the ground, listening to 2 children say goodbye in words I would never learn the meaning of. Then there was the question of what came next, and there wasn't but one answer, and I hated it. I could not leave them, that was plain. Leaving them was the same as killing them, only slower and further off where I wouldn't have to watch, and I had done a great many hard things in my life, but I had never yet learned that particular trick. And I could not take them into Lodestone, because Lodestone in that year would have taken them off me, and I did not care to think about where they'd go from there. There were places children like these went, reservations gone to fever. Schools back east where they cut a child's hair and beat the words out of his mouth. And there was the sort of man, more than one, who wouldn't have bothered with a school. So I did the only thing left, which was the wrong thing by every law and custom I lived under, and the only right thing my gut would let me do. I put both children up on Deuce, and I walked alongside leading, and I took them home. It's 9 miles from that wash to my place. We did it slow, keeping to the low ground off the ridgelines where a rider could skyline us. Twice I heard horses and put us into a stand of mesquite and stood with my hand on Deuce's nose and my heart going like a drum, and both times the children went so still and silent that I half forgot they were there. They knew how to disappear. God help me, they were better at it than I was, and they'd learned it younger. The second time, a patrol went by close enough that I could hear the jingle of the bits and one trooper laughing at something. 4 of them. Blue coats gone gray with dust. And I stood there in the mesquite with 2 Apache children I was stealing away from the entire United States Army, and I understood, really understood, in the meat of me, that I had crossed a line I could not uncross. If they were found on my land, I would not be able to explain it. There is no explaining it. A man in that country did not take in the children of the enemy. He just didn't. The boy watched the soldiers pass, and then he looked up at me, checking, I realized. Checking whether I'd call out, whether I'd traded them for something. And when the last blue coat was gone into the heat shimmer and I let out my breath and we moved on, he watched me a moment longer, recalculating. I was not adding up to anything he had a name for. I could see it troubling him. In his experience of the world, men like me did not do the thing I was doing, and a child who has learned that hard men are dangerous is not comforted by a hard man being kind. He is only more afraid because he cannot find the trap. We got to the place near dark. It isn't much. A low adobe house Marta and I built with our own hands, a barn, a corral, a windmill that had been squealing for a bolt for 2 years, and 2 graves up on the little rise behind, one long and one very short. My wife, and our boy who lived 4 days, I don't speak of him. I'm only telling you because of what the girl did. I got the children down and I got them inside and I got some beans and cold cornbread into them, and they ate the way starved things eat, fast and low over the plate with an arm curled round it. And then the girl, who had not made a sound the whole 9 miles, walked to the window and looked out at that rise in the last of the light, at the 2 crosses I'd made, and she looked at them a long time. And she turned around and she pointed at the little one, the short grave, and she looked at me and asked me something. I didn't have the words, but I had the pointing and I had her face and I knew exactly what she'd asked. Who is that one for? And I don't know why, I had not said his name aloud in 3 years, not to a living soul, but I said it. I said his name to an Apache girl who couldn't understand a word of me in the dark of a kitchen with the beans going cold. And my voice did a thing I wasn't ready for. She watched me say it. She looked back at the little grave, and then she nodded slow like a person taking down a fact they mean to keep, like she'd filed it somewhere careful. And she came back to the table and sat down by her brother and went on eating, and I stood at my own window with my hand pressed flat against the wall, and I braided nothing, because both my hands were shaking too hard to braid. That was the first day. I put them in the small room that had never once been used for its purpose. I gave the boy a blanket, and he gave it to his sister. I latched nothing, because latching it would have told them what they were, and I already knew I didn't want them to be that. I sat up most of that night at the table with the lamp turned low and my rifle across my knees, listening not for them, for the road. And somewhere past midnight, when I'd near talked myself into believing I'd get away with it, I heard a horse. One rider coming up my track slow and easy the way a man comes who has all night and no doubt. I doused the lamp. I moved to the window. And I saw, black against the star gray, the shape of my nearest neighbor Halloran, sitting his horse at the mouth of my yard, just sitting there looking at my dark house. Halloran was not a bad man. That was the trouble. Halloran was a decent, church-going, law-abiding man, and there was no man on earth I had more to fear than a decent one just then. He sat there a long minute, and then he called out easy into the dark. "Marsh, you up? Saw your fire from the ridge earlier, figured-eyed." He stopped, because a child had cried out in her sleep once thin and sharp from the small room, and gone quiet. And Halloran sat his horse in my yard in the dark, and did not say anything at all for what felt like the rest of my life. Halloran didn't come to the door that night. That was the worst of it. A man who comes to your door is a man you can talk to. A man who sits in your yard, hears a child that has no business being in your house, and then just clucks to his horse and rides off slow into the dark without a word. That's a man who's gone home to think. And a thinking neighbor in that country in that year was a lit fuse you couldn't find the end of to pinch out. I didn't sleep. Come gray light, I was still at the window, and the two of them came out of the small room together. Always together. I never once in all that time saw one of them go anywhere the other wasn't, and stood in the doorway looking at me. "Morning," I said. The boy said something to the girl. The girl looked at me and said, careful, sounding it out like a stone she was setting down, "Morning." I about dropped my coffee. That was how it started, the talking. She was quicker than her brother at it, though he was quicker at everything that mattered more. She'd point and I'd name it, and she'd take the word and turn it over and put it away. And by the end of that first week she had 30 words, then 50, and the boy had maybe 10 that he'd say, and 100 I was sure he understood and wouldn't let on to. He held his words the way he'd held that canteen. Careful, rationed, like there might not be more. Their names I learned on the 4th day, and I'll admit to you I never got them right, not the way they truly said them. The sound sat too far back in a place my mouth couldn't reach. But the girl patted her own chest and said a word twice, patient, and the nearest my ear could come was Nolly. And she put her hand on her brother and said his, and the best I could make of it was Katie, and when I said them back wrong, she didn't laugh. She just fixed her eyes on me and said them again, slower, giving me another try. A generous child, more generous than the world had earned from her. I kept them hid. That was the whole of my thinking, those first weeks, keep them out of sight, keep the smoke low in the daytime, keep them off the ridge, and pray Halloran's Christian conscience was arguing with itself long enough for me to figure a plan. I'd take Deuce down for supplies, and my heart would be in my mouth the whole ride into Lodestone, watching every face for the one that knew. And every ride home was worse, because every ride home I was half sure I'd top the last rise and find the yard full of horses. And the whole time I was falling. I didn't have a word for it then. I have one now, and it's the plainest one there is, and I'll not be shy of it. I loved them. It came on me sideways, the way the worst and best things do. It came on me when Katie mended the windmill. That boy could not have been 8, and he stood under that squealing windmill for the better part of an afternoon, studying it, the way I'd seen him study me in the wash, doing his arithmetic. And then he climbed the tower, which about stopped my heart, and he found the loose bolt I'd been ignoring for 2 years, and he had no wrench, so he wedged it tight with a folded strip of tin and a stone, and the squealing stopped. 2 years I'd listened to that thing cry. A child fixed it in an afternoon because it bothered him, and he was not the sort to leave a thing that bothered him unfixed. He came down the tower and looked at me, not proud, just checking again. Is this all right? Did I do wrong? And I laughed. First time I'd laughed in longer than I could tell you. And Nolly laughed because I did, and after a second careful rationing it, Katie almost did too. That was the afternoon I stopped thinking of it as trouble I'd taken on, and started thinking of it as mine. Which was, of course, exactly when the lieutenant came. He came on a Tuesday with 2 troopers, and I saw the dust a mile off and had time to get the children into the root cellar under the kitchen floor, which I'd made ready for exactly this and prayed I'd never use. Nolly went down without a sound. Katie went down last, and before I dropped the boards over them, he looked up at me out of that hole in the ground, and I have never in my life been looked at like that. He wasn't afraid for himself. I'd have sworn to it. He was afraid of me, of what I might do with them down there and soldiers in the yard. He'd handed me the last card he had. And there was nothing I could do but drop the boards and put the rug back and stand up and go be a liar for the first time in a life that had otherwise, whatever else, been honest. The lieutenant's name was Prout, and here is a thing I have never been able to make simple. He was not a cruel man. I have known cruel men, and Prout wasn't one. He was young and dead tired and sick to the back teeth of the work he'd been given, and it showed on him like a fever. He got down off his horse and took off his hat and asked could he trouble me for water, and drank it slow, and looked out at my sorry grays with a sorry kind of understanding, one failing man to another. You'll have heard, he said, we're gathering them in, all of them. Sending them east. He said east the way you'd say a curse you were too tired to put feeling into. There was a bunch scattered off a wagon column 10 days back out toward the creek. Women, children mostly, we've been finding them. He turned his cup in his hands. Finding them dead, mostly. That's so, I said. You seen anything, anybody, out this way? And here was the moment. Here was the whole thing, balanced on a word. Down in the dark under my kitchen floor, 2 children were holding their breath, and above them I stood in the sun and looked a decent, exhausted young soldier in the eye, and I said, no, nothing out this way but me. He looked at me a beat too long. I have wondered ever since exactly what he knew. I think I have come to think that he knew something or guessed it. I think that cup of water and that talk of dead children was Prout giving me a door to walk through if I wanted, and I didn't walk through it, and he let me not. He put his hat back on. He said, if you do see anyone, they're better off found by us than by some of what's riding around out here. There's men taking scalps for bounty and not being particular whose. He said it to the horizon, not to me. That's all. Better off found by us. Then he mounted up and took his troopers and rode off, and I stood in my yard until the dust settled. And then I went in and pried up the boards, and Nolly came up first and then Katie. And Katie looked at me, asking, always asking, that boy with his eyes, what did you trade? And I got down on my knees on my own kitchen floor, which my knees did not thank me for, so I was level with him, and I said, nothing. I traded nothing. I told him no. He didn't understand all the words. He understood no. And something in his face that had been braced since the wash, braced for weeks, some load-bearing thing, shifted just a little. Not trust. I wouldn't call it trust yet. But he stopped for the first time looking for the trap, because he'd finally seen the place where the trap should have been, and it was empty. It should have been the good part, and it was for a while, weeks of it. The 3 of us and the mule and the Mendied windmill and the low autumn light. Nolly learning to make cornbread and burning it and laughing and learning it right. Katie rebuilding the corral gate better than I'd built it. Me teaching them checkers with dried beans and buttons, and Katie beating me inside of 3 nights, and beating me every night after, without mercy, dry little smile on him each time he did it, which was the closest that boy came to joy, and I took it and was glad of it. And every night the 2 of them in the small room, and the door I never latched. The trouble with love, if you've come to it late and hard the way I had, is that it makes you a coward in a whole new direction. I'd been brave, sort of, in the taking of them. But now that I had them, the fear changed its shape. Now I was afraid all the time, and the fear made me small. I kept them closer, kept the smoke lower. Snapped at Nolly once for singing in her own house, the only home she had because the window was open and sound carries. I saw her face close up when I did it. Saw her go quiet and careful, the way she'd been in the wash, and I hated myself, and I couldn't stop, because underneath every good day was the drumbeat of they'll take them, someone will come and take them. Halloran didn't come back, but I heard in town the way you hear things, a word here, a look there, a conversation that stops when you walk up to the store counter. I heard that Halloran had been asking, quiet and Christian, whether anyone knew was Marsh keeping company these days. I heard my own name in a lowered voice, and I bought my flour and my coffee, and I rode home with my back cold the whole way. And it came to a head as these things do over nothing, over the smallest thing. It was a cold night late, and Nolly had had one of her dreams. She had them still, cried out in her sleep the way she had that first night, the way that had frozen Halloran in my yard, and I'd gone in to sit with them the way I'd taken to doing, just sitting on the floor by their pallet till the breathing evened out. And I thought they were both asleep. And into the dark, low, in that careful rationed English he'd built word by hoarded word all that autumn, Katie asked me something. 5 words, he'd been saving them, I think, saving them the way he saved everything. "Are you keeping us," he said, "or hiding us?" And I did not have one thing to say. Because he'd found it, the thing I'd been not looking at for 2 months. He'd done his arithmetic, that boy, the arithmetic he'd been doing since the wash, and he'd come out with the true number, and he'd laid it down in front of me in the dark. A thing you hide you're ashamed of. A thing you hide you'll give up when the cost gets high enough because it was never yours, only borrowed against your fear. But a thing you keep that in the open. You keep it where the world can see and be damned to it. He knew the difference. 8 years old, and he knew the difference better than I did. Because he'd been on the wrong side of it his whole short life. Always the thing being hidden. Always the thing given up when the cost came due. "Are you keeping us or hiding us?" I sat on the floor in the dark, and I could not answer him, because I knew which one it was, and I was ashamed. And outside, a long way off but coming, I heard horses. More than one, more than Prout's 2. I'll tell you what I did with that question in the end. But I have to tell it in order, or it won't mean anything, and I've come too far now to have it mean nothing. That night, the horses I heard didn't come to my door. They went by on the road, 4 or 5 of them, riding hard and careless in the dark, and I stood at the window with my rifle and watched them pass and gone. Not soldiers, no blue in them, no order to how they rode. The other kind. The kind Prout had meant when he'd looked at the horizon and said not being particular whose. Bounty men, scalp men, riding somewhere in the dark with a purpose, and I did not want to know what it was. They passed, and I stood there a long time after the sound of them was gone. And behind me in the dark Katie's question was still lying on the floor where he'd set it down, and I knew that when the light came I was going to have to pick it up. I didn't sleep, nothing new there, but this was a different not sleeping. All the other nights I'd lain awake doing sums of fear, how to hide them better, how to be smaller, how to last. That night I did a different kind of sum, and it was worse because it had a true answer, and the answer cost everything. Here it is plain. I had 2 choices, and I'd been pretending I had more. I could go on the way I'd been going. Hide them. Keep the smoke low and the girl from singing and the boy off the tower where he could be seen. Live small and scared and give a child the lesson that he was a thing to be ashamed of, a thing kept in a cellar when men came. I could do that, and I might get away with it a year, 2 years, until Halloran's conscience or a bounty man's luck or my own bad fortune ran it down. And every day of those years I'd be teaching Katie the exact thing the world had already taught him too well, that he was contraband. That the best he could hope for was to be somebody's guilty secret. Or I could do the thing his question had already told me was the only honest thing. I could stop hiding them and start keeping them, out loud, which meant in that country in that year that I could not stay. There was no keeping Apache children in the open within 100 miles of Lodestone. To keep them, I'd have to lose everything else. The house Marta and I built with our hands, the grays, sorry as it was, the 2 graves on the rise. The 2 graves on the rise. That was the hook of it, the barb that wouldn't pull free. To keep the living children, I'd have to leave the dead one. Leave my wife and my son on that hill and ride north and never come back to tend them, never come back at all. And I sat with that all night, turning it, and every time I turned it, it cut me the same, and along about the blackest part before dawn, I near talked myself into the small, safe, cowardly thing, the way a man will. And then Nolly got up. She thought I was asleep. She got up quiet in the dark, and I watched her, not letting on, through my lashes. And she went to the window the way she had that very first night, and she looked out at the rise, at the 2 crosses gray against the graying sky. And she stood there a while. And then soft, so soft, hardly more than breath, she sang. I don't know what it was. Her words, her people's words, low and tuneless to my ear, and the most tuneful thing I ever heard. She sang it at my wife's grave and my son's grave, at 2 dead white strangers she'd never met in the dark, because she'd seen me grieve them, and she'd filed it away careful that first night, This one is his, this one hurts him, and she had carried it 2 months, and this was what she did with it. She sang for my dead. She gave them that. A child who'd had everything taken and buried her own mother in a wash with a corn-husk doll, and she stood at my window and spent what she had on my grief. And I understood, finally, all the way down, the thing Katie's question had been reaching for. I'd had it backwards the whole time. I'd been carrying it like a burden I'd taken on out of pity, the poor children, the trouble I'd shouldered, the risk I bore for their sake. Like I was the one giving. And I sat there in the dark and watched a little girl sing to my dead wife, and I understood that they'd been keeping me the whole time. That I'd been a dead man walking since Marta, a man who'd walled it all up and gone hollow, and 2 orphans out of a dry wash had put their small hands against that wall every day for 2 months without ever once being asked. I wasn't their rescue. We were each other's. And a thing like that you do not hide in a cellar. A thing like that you keep in the open, and you pay whatever it costs, because it is the only thing you've got that's worth the paying. Come dawn, I knew what I was doing. I didn't tell them yet. I went about the morning ordinary, and after we'd eaten, I saddled Deuce and I rode into Lodestone one last time. Not for supplies. I went to the land agent, and I sold my place, sold it fast and cheap, which raised eyebrows, and I let it. And I took the paper money and I bought 2 more horses and a pack mule and supplies for a long ride north. And I did it all in the open in the middle of town with folks watching because I was done hiding anything, myself included. And then I did the one thing I'd sworn I wouldn't. I rode out to Halloran's. He came to the door. Decent, church-going Halloran who'd sat in my yard in the dark 2 months back and heard a child and ridden off to think. He looked at me a long moment. "Marsh," he said. "I'm leaving," I told him. "Selling out, riding north tomorrow, and I've got 2 children with me, and I expect you know that, and I expect you've known it since August." I made myself hold his eye. "I'm not asking your blessing. I'm asking you give me 1 day's start before you tell anyone what you know. 1 day. For no reason but that I'm asking it, one man to another." He looked at me, and Halloran, "I'll go to my own grave not knowing all of what went on behind that decent face," Halloran said, slow. "I don't know what you're talking about, Marsh. I don't know about any children." And he said it looking dead at me, so I'd be sure to understand that he was choosing to not know, that this was a gift and I should take it and not make him say another word. "Ride safe," he said. "It's hard country north." And he shut the door. I have thought about him near as much as I've thought about that boy's face in the wash. A decent man who by every law and custom he lived under should have turned me in, and who instead shut a door on his own knowing and let me go. There's more of that in the world than the stories tell you. Quiet men choosing in a doorway to not know a thing. It's most of what mercy ever is out here, somebody deciding not to look. We left before light the next morning. I took them up to the rise first. I owed the dead that much, and I owed the living the seeing of it. I stood at Marta's grave and I said my goodbye out loud, which I'd never once managed in 3 years of standing there mute, and I found I could say it now with the children beside me when I'd never been able to say it alone. That's the whole of it, maybe. That's the thing I'd been too hollow to know. You can't say goodbye alone. You need somebody standing by to say it to. Nolly put something down at the foot of the little cross. I looked. It was the cornhusk doll, her mother's doll, the one thing she'd carried out of that wash, that she'd put in her own mother's grave and then, somehow, taken back or made another. I never knew which and didn't ask. She left it there for a boy she'd never met who'd lived 4 days. And Katie stood beside me, and after a while in his careful, rationed English, he asked me the last question I'll tell you about, and it was the smallest of them all. "We go together," he said. 2 months of his life he'd spent doing arithmetic on whether he could trust me. 2 months of checking my hands, waiting for the trade, looking for the trap. And it had come down in the end to that. We go together. Not will you keep us, he had his answer to that one now. He was watching me sell my whole world to do it. Just together, all 3, was that the shape of it? Was he reading it right at last? "We go together," I said. And I picked him up, he let me, which he'd never once done, that boy who wouldn't be carried, who'd carried his sister 9 miles of his own life before I ever found them. He let me lift him up onto the horse, and I got Nolly up behind, and I mounted Deuce, and we turned north into the cold and the coming light with 2 graves at our backs and everything else in front. I never went back. I never saw Lodestone again, nor Halloran, nor Prout, though I heard years later he'd left the army, and I hoped to God he found some quieter work. I couldn't tell you if it all came right in the end, the way you'd want a story to. It came the way life comes, some right and some not, and the children grew, and there were more hard questions than the ones I've told you, and some of them I answered wrong. But we went together, whatever else. We went together and I stopped hiding, and the last thing I remember of that place is Nolly, on the horse behind her brother, turning once to look back at the rise as we rode at the two crosses, and the little doll at the foot of the small one, and then facing north again and not looking back a second time. She never did ask me why I'd stopped that first day at the lip of the wash, why I'd climbed down instead of riding on. I've wondered all these years what I'd have told her.